want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey folks, welcome back to the Enemies List. I'm Rick Wilson, your host as always, and I am joined today by Jason Stanley. Jason Stanley is the author of a book you should really read, and it's called How Fascism Works. Because it's a phrase that we use a lot in the country right now, especially in the era of Trump, and not every American really gets it. But most importantly, he's got a book coming out in September called Erasing History, How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. And maybe you're familiar with that feeling. Maybe you've sensed that out there in the world right now because you see people making wild claims about things that just aren't real and people claiming things didn't happen that happened. And so I thought it was important to talk to Jason today to really have a conversation about this and to dig into why revisionism and this sort of ahistorical approach to everything only means what Donald Trump and Fox say it means has really broken a lot of Americans. So, Jason, with that, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on today. And you've written a lot. You are one of the preeminent authors of analyzing fascism in this country and around the world. And you've made the strong argument that we are into the legal sort of scrapping phase of fascism and the phase where we start to rewrite the history of this country or any country is a key element of how authoritarians take power. And talk to us about that and tell us how you came to write this particular book.
So I came to write this particular book because I recognized the historical moment. And I thought I needed a book to come out in the fall as we're heading into the most consequential election of our lives. Now to your first and most important question, how revisionist history helps authoritarianism. Well, by erasing the perspectives of different groups in your country, you erase their voices. So authoritarianism always erases social movements that have challenged it. For example, in China, you're not allowed to teach about Tiananmen Square. It's illegal. The Soviet Union erased all history of the bad things Stalin did, like Holodomor, the genocide of the Ukrainian people. So you represent the history, and the history in particular of the dominant group, as great and innocent. So what we have now, to continue the thread of social movements in Florida. They've erased the history of Black Lives Matter. Right. So if you erase the history of social movements, you erase the history of the perspectives of groups of our fellow Americans, like LGBT Americans or Black Americans, then you're representing their social change, their social movements as completely apolitical and incomprehensible. If you set up hierarchy, you say there's a great country. It was founded by these men, these white Christian men who were the inheritors of Greece and Rome. And it had this great civilization. And there were a few bumps along the way. But they were solved by great men like Martin Luther King ended racism. And and structures are illegal to talk about. We have states all over the country where you can't talk about, for example, structural racism. If you can't talk about structural racism, you can't talk about the history of Jim Crow, the legacy of Jim Crow. You can't talk about things like poll taxes. You can't, and poll taxes as they're reflected today. You can't talk about the the history of mortgages, so you can't explain why there's residential segregation, things like
Hmm.
that. So democracy requires us to know everyone's perspective. So we share a common reality, we share a common history, and we can go forward trying to create a better history, a more democratic society. If you erase all of that, then
Right.
people are just like, okay, it's great. Why is anyone complaining?
The idea of of removing textbooks from classrooms, the idea of removing history from classrooms in Florida and other states, but Florida is really sort of the alpha dog of a lot of these efforts based on Ron DeSantis. It is so expressly political. It is so obviously built to remove a context and a character of history um, from young people who are coming up and who do not know. People don't have history inherently plugged into their brain. It just doesn't exist de novo. And so this idea, it seems like there is a belief on the right and on the authoritarian part of the spectrum. Man, maybe I'm repeating myself. um, that that if we produce a different history for them, if we boulderize it, or if we decontextualize it, or if we take out the history of slavery, or if we try to make slavery into a problem that was because of the Democratic Party or any of these other like weird approaches they take, at some point these kids are going to either collide with reality in a way that really breaks them. I think that really harms them, because they don't understand the world. They don't understand what really happened, and they're confronted by that problem by people who have still grounding in that. Um, but my question is, how well can that work if it's only at the state level? I mean, look, it's affecting a couple of big states, Florida and Texas, just being two, but I mean, this really is a program they have to implement it nationally if they're going to really make it work.
Well, they're trying. That's part of Trump's education campaign. It's part of Trump
Hmm.
Project 2025. They're threatening to level child abuse charges against teachers who teach obscenity. And notice that there's a very wide conception of obscenity here.
Hmm.
So well, this is what the Nazis did too. They declared LGBT perspectives obscene. Of course, they mass burned LGBT books by LGBT authors.
Right.
The Institute of Sexual Science was burned in the first large book burning by the SS, May 10th, 1933.
Hmm.
They had this very wide conception of obscenity that included works by Jewish authors. And what we're seeing now is that wide conception of obscenity employed. It's employed against Toni Morrison, America's great
Right.
Nobel Prize winner for literature, whose books
Hmm.
are being banned everywhere. So we have again the work of minority groups, of the great literature of of traditionally non-dominant groups, traditionally
Right.
obsessed groups being banned. We're seeing this in Hungary today with this Ron DeSantis and Trump's model, Viktor
Hmm.
Orban, who removed from the curriculum the only Hungarian Nobel Prize winner in literature who was a Jewish Holocaust survivor, and
Right.
replaced him by minor far right Hungarian anti-Semitic Hungarian nationalists of the past. So
Right.
so this idea of removing even the greatest writers, removing Toni Morrison, surely one of the great authors of the world of the past 50 years,
By
from
far.
our
By
curriculum
far.
is shocking. And this idea of having a broad conception of obscenity and then coming in and saying, on this broad conception, if you teach any of these works, you're abusing children or doing something similar, is reminiscent of the worst regimes in history. And now let's look at these divisive concepts laws and what they do. They say you're
Right.
not allowed to teach in a way that makes people feel guilty. Well, who's the people in question? or feel a sense of shame. They use that term, shame.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Mm-hmm.
if you don't teach the history of structural racism, then Black children will think their parents' poverty is their own fault, and they will feel a sense of shame. They'll think, what? So the people are white people who are not supposed to feel a sense of shame.
Yeah, I think that is a big underpinning of this. Um, the control of education, the control of knowledge, the control of history, the control of context. It is something that I think, as you mentioned right in the beginning, in China they don't teach Tiananmen. In authoritarian states, they're obsessive about controlling what people can read, and because that gives people perspective and the ability to think and act. Um, Americans are not notoriously a nation of readers any longer. And so a lot of the history they're being given now and being fed now is reinterpretation through social media platforms, reinterpretation through video platforms of what history really is. And I think like I started worrying about this problem way back when I was still in the Republican Party, even where I heard guys like Glenn Beck and Alex Jones bringing on crank historian, fake historians like Skousen and other people that have this very coherent and cohesive and false narrative about America's past. Those people, you know, they're transitioning out of writing crank history books, and now they're transitioning to making crank history TikToks and crank history YouTube videos. Where do you see the it's not just the ability to suppress information, it's the ability to disseminate wildly false information. I think that really concerns me. Where does that fit into the book?
Well, the mistrust, I discussed this in the book, the mistrust of mainstream media, the lack of the disseminating complete mistrust of national media. Not that national media has covered itself in glory lately, but
Right.
when you completely remove trust from national media, and local media, which people trust a lot, is taken over by organizations like the Sinclair Group, which is far
Right.
right and controls, 30% of local TV stations. So when you do that, if people have no trust in media, they'll turn to social media. They'll turn to their friend
Right.
groups, and we see this. Facebook didn't understand this. What happens with social
Mm-hmm.
media in countries that do not have a press that anyone trusts, like Myanmar. Um,
Right.
so, so we see this. So we see in the UK even false.
As we're recording this, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. False rumors spreading on social media. People trust their friend groups. It's particularly bad in societies like Myanmar, where people don't
Right.
trust the national media. But that's why you want to undercut the national media, trust in the national media, so people rely on social media rumors, essentially. And then you're leaving your elections essentially up to malignant actors. Like right now, I'm seeing what's clearly Russian propaganda and agitation on both sides, left and right, on social media.
Mm-hmm.
For
Mm-hmm.
example, every time you see all these tweets, the Democrats are genocideers, don't vote for Democrats because of Gaza, and then suddenly 25 likes, which is not to say
Right.
that Democrats shouldn't be criticized, but that's obviously Hillary
Right,
Clinton, predator.
yeah, right, but it's from it's from an account with two followers that was just formed 12 hours ago.
Exactly. So
um, so it does weaponize the ability to scale in the modern society. Um,
when you have
you know,
a national media that's both siding everything, one thing to think about is, how did
mhm,
we get into a situation when a large number of Americans close to 50% believe that there's a significant a problem of voter fraud in the country. We have the cleanest elections in history.
Yes.
There were like less than 10 cases of in-person voter fraud between 2000 and 2010 in
Correct.
national, state, and local elections. How did we get to this point where it's like people believing in green fairies? And then you have autocrats like Ron DeSantis, who has an office to prosecute voter fraud, and produces and a law that restricts voter registration groups. So if they make a tiny little mistake, they have to pay tens of thousands of dollars.
Right.
So, and that's the media's fault, because the media is saying, the Republicans believe in green elves behind every tree, and the Democrats don't. And so people are going to believe in green elves, in this case, voter fraud. Now, Ron DeSantis is a Yale grad and a Harvard grad. These are real.
Oh, yeah.
Like, J.D. Vance is a Yale man. I'm at Yale. He's a Yale man. People around here like him, respect him. He's a Yale man. DeSantis is a Yale and Harvard man. They know what they're doing when they're spreading these lies.
Sure. I think that's one of the most pernicious parts of this entire affair, is that there is a degree of the meritocracy, who should know better and be better, are playing along with this idea that they can sort of somehow play footsie with enough of the fascist movement to get away with it. And at the end, they don't really understand that it will consume them too. It will eat them last.
I think some of them are fascists.
No doubt, no doubt about it. There are a meaningful number of them who have fully embraced the hate and have fully embraced the idea that democracy has failed, that a representative government has failed, that the republic has failed, and that the only solution now is to burn down all those institutions that defined it. And that's another part of fascism. You replace all the institutions in society with the will of the party or the will of the leader.
Yes, and we have too many one-party states in the United States, gerrymandered one-party states like North Carolina, where there's states where, when I give talks in Europe and I tell people like Mississippi has well over 30% Black population, people just don't believe me, because obviously Black people in Mississippi have zero political power. So, we have a crisis, and now the the MAGA Republicans are saying we're not a democracy. We're not a democracy, we're a republic, even though we're a republic, even though those are the same thing.
It is, that is one of the most irritating and pernicious, like, I call it a dorm room argument. You get that from MAGAs a lot. Like, we don't live in a democracy, we live in a republic. Well, yes, those two things can go together. Those two things can exist as one. It's like Kamala Harris can be both Asian and Black. The idea, though, that they're going to define what the country is and not just where it came from is, I think, their most aggressive goal. I think they really want to define this country along the lines that would look a lot more, when they ignore the founders' intent, except that they would like the one part about the founders' intent, that the franchise should be basically white property owning men. And it just strikes me, really consistently strikes me, that they've skipped over the phase where they have to like persuade people to change the country. They just want to reset.
That's right. They know that the future is not theirs. So if it's a democracy, then it's going to be young people are much more pro-liberty. They're much more, obviously restrictions on books, abortion illegal in the case of rape and incest, LGBT rights. These are things that young people are for. In my own case, Ukraine, funding for Ukraine, not helping Vladimir Putin, the international fight against autocracy. This is at stake in this election. As Trump said, I like Vladimir Putin. I'm friends with Vladimir. That's a good thing. Imagine someone saying that about Hitler. I like
Right.
Adolf Hitler. We're friends. That's a good thing. So we face. Also, I want to say one thing about rewriting history: the election fraud idea.
Sure.
So this is very central in structuring for MAGA Republicans. And if you don't think that that can immediately enter schools, then you don't know your history, because the Nazi textbooks I looked at have they focus on the so-called stab in the back myth that
Of
Jews
course.
betrayed Germany in World War I. And there's all sorts of stuff about we lost our colonies in Africa, our place in the sun in Versailles. So
Hmm.
can expect that to enter schools. And finally, the United States has the best university system in the world. Maybe we're not all readers, but we have by far the best university system.
No question.
And they are like Ron DeSantis has already destroyed the new College of Florida. The AAU
Hmm.
report on Florida is horrifying. Like
Horrifying.
horrifying. And Tennessee, there's now an online reporting form where you can report your professors for teaching divisive concepts.
Yep.
These are destruction of the best, and this constant attack on our universities. Think of the engines of economic stability in so many cities and towns across the country. And the foreign students that come to our country, the research that gets done, they're trying to destroy our university system.
They have a aggressively sharp idea that the university system is a threat to their political power. They believe that universities universally 100% of the time transform quote unquote good American kids into raging communists or transsexual activists or celebrity abortionists or whatever craziness they have floating in their head at that moment. And I think that's just an incredibly dangerous and incredibly pernicious idea that that is so phenomenally risky for this country.
Yeah, our Harvard, Yale, and Princeton have produced Ted Cruz, Ron DeSantis, Tom Cotton, J.D.
J.D.
Vance,
Vance.
Josh Hawley, who's gone, so I'm not Chris Kobach in Kansas, the
Yep.
incredibly.
I know Chris very well. I've known
Yeah.
Chris for way too many years. Elise Stefanik. I mean, there's a whole
Stefanik, Harvard. I mean, I went to SUNY Stony Brook. I don't know what is going on with all these Yale and Harvard graduates being central to the fascist movement. And then they say everyone has to like learn from Prager U and Hillsdale College instead of the universities they went to.
Right. And all of it comes down, I think, in the end again to that really intense desire that in a part of the conservative movement, that kind of the part that I came out of, true story, honest answer, self-reflection, this adulation of the founders among honest people in the movement. We know that the founders were phenomenal geniuses of liberty, except that the initial operating system of the country had a gigantic bug, a flaw in it that led to the deaths of 500,000 Americans in the Civil War. And it still haunts us to this minute of our lives. But I started to feel that there was this desire among the Glenn Beck, Steve Bannon, Alex Jones, weirdo Breitbart media wing of the party back sometime in the Obama era, that they were going to erase that part of our history, and that they were desperate to make white people feel better and say, it's not your fault. These interlopers to the world, this Barack Obama and these others, they're trying to just govern you through guilt. And the fact is, we should feel enormous pride in how much we've bent the arc, but that's no reason to stop bending the arc.
That's right. And we should, so central to fascism is the idea that the dominant group is great and innocent. So
Yes.
That's very central. And the idea is immigrants are going to ruin that. They're going to replace the great and the innocent
All
by
right.
rapists and criminals and people with no accomplishment. So,
Mm-hmm.
and I've said this for years. You have a fascist movement in the United States that does this. It's going to be reflected in other countries. Now we see Alternative for Deutschland in Germany that's
Sure.
running on removing Holocaust education, removing the Holocaust memorial from Berlin. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I'm always shocked by my fellow Jewish people who are critical, who are supportive of this movement to whitewash our past, because is
Right.
doing, you know, this is not something that can be contained. Every country, all the countries with far right movements linked to each other are doing this. And in the United States, I mean, as you said, what we can be proud of is bending the arc. Think of the civil rights movement. There's not a hamlet in the world where they don't know about the civil rights movement,
That's
because
right.
they went to Alabama and Mississippi, and some of the scariest places to do that work in the world, and
Right.
confronted dogs and sheriffs and extreme violence, and even death in some cases. So we have this. We have a history. We have a labor history. They attack
Sure.
labor history, but what is responsible for the weekend? What is responsible for the 8-hour workday? it's our labor.
Correct.
They're like, oh, look at what capitalism has brought us. Actually, a lot of those great things were done by the labor movement. So
Yeah.
they're trying to erase that entire history and say, no, 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 America's always been Andrew Carnegie and Henry Ford and wealthy people doing capitalism. So don't worry, don't be politically involved. Just leave it up to the Peter Thiels of the world.
Yeah. And I think there's, while there was a political movement, honestly, in the post 1960s window, but I really think it kicked off on the new right in the Obama era. But now there's also a political movement that wants to empower it with the greatest amount of money and technology it's ever seen, in the roles of Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and all these other folks, because they they have a very different understanding of freedom and liberty and democracy and justice than folks who are not worth tens or hundreds of billions of dollars and who do not live in a Silicon Valley wealth bubble where they think that they are a different species than the rest of us.
The tech fascists. And the tech fascists are funding what we see, just like the businessmen funded Hitler for shutting down the labor unions. So
The broligarchs, as someone said
the
them,
oligarchs.
refer
So
to
we're
them.
drifting. It's no surprise that we're drifting into a Russia type situation. It's not good for business because, are you going to be one of the oligarchs? And if not, then, your business is subject to being seized and sold to them. It's a
Right.
patronage system. So what we have, like Peter Thiel's been very explicit that he thinks that democracy, essentially a monarchy. He
Right.
prefers, and I think these guys, they don't want, they think it's unfreedom if Joe Schmo from New Jersey can vote to raise their taxes. um,
Right.
Barry Weiss recently made a joke, but I think it's very accurate. She said, there are people, speaking to a large crowd, she said, there are people in this room who are against my marriage. She's LGBT,
Yeah.
uh, married to another woman. And she said, but that's okay. We're all Americans who want tax cuts. And I think that's what's going on. Peter Thiel is LGBT,
Yeah.
but he's funding anti-LGBT politicians because it's going to give him power and tax cuts. For
Yep.
him, he thinks that he thinks of Americans as dumb rubes who he can
Yep.
use homophobia. He can employ homophobia to get them to cut his taxes.
I think that there's a degree to which they have a sort of coder slash tech broligarch attitude that they are going to use whatever tools in the toolbox, because they believe that all tools are morally vacant. They think all technology is morally agnostic, And so they're going to use whatever technology they can use to get to, I think, some very dark ends. And warning about it, I think, is something that you've done beautifully in this book. And I think it's something that we need to like keep listening to, because fighting fascism is a full-time job, folks. It is something that if you let it grow, it will grow. If you let it metastasize, it sure will metastasize. So I wanted to thank you, Jason, for coming on the show today and for a terrific conversation about this.
And thank you for the work you do.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So, Jason, tell us where folks can reach you.
I try to stay
on
off
socials.
I try to stay off social media.
God, that's so smart.
And let my work do my talking for me.
I love it. Well, folks, once again, the book is Erasing History: How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. Get it, check it out. Jason's other books on fascism are absolutely vital, especially How Fascism Works. And it is really important that you understand what's going on out there beyond sort of the vague idea of fascism. It's real, it's around, it's growing, it's really trying for a big win this year. So let's all stay focused. Thanks again for coming on the show. And Jason, we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much, Rick.
You bet.
You know, folks, we've had a long run in American politics where the idea that the media was hopelessly liberal, broken so deeply in the progressive side that no sense or sensibility could sneak through, that every conservative idea was stamped out ruthlessly and instantaneously. Can I just point out that that's some ref playing bullshit like I've never seen before? Because let's be real. Donald Trump has given 3 press conferences in this last week. Those 3 press conferences were a torrent, a veritable flood, a tidal wave, a monsoon of lies and bullshit. And yet the media treated them, by and large, as if these were perfectly ordinary political press conferences. They fact-checked some of the lies, but you couldn't fact-check them all, not even if you were an AI hooked up to the biggest supercomputers in the world. The lies came so fast and so dense that it was impossible to discern anything from any signal from that noise. But look, these folks in the press treated Donald Trump each time as if he were a serious person, as if these were real interviews, as if the content of these supposed press conferences was newsworthy. Now, to their credit, during the last one, CNN did duck out because they finally, I think, had some shred of dignity and recognized it was just crap. But I got to tell you, folks, we've got to stop believing that you have to both sides Donald Trump, that you have to tell both sides of a lie, that you have to treat every event that he does as something that is newsworthy in and of itself. You know, I've noticed the press is getting their back up. They're very angry with Vice President Harris now because they don't think she's done enough sit-down interviews with them. You know, they've allowed Trump to be the most transgressive and abusive player in American political history, and they're acting as if somehow Harris has violated this unwritten or written rule that she must bow down to them and must give them a long interview. Well, right now, folks, she's too busy winning. She's too busy being out there kicking the door down, kicking Donald Trump's ass. And you know what? I think she's right. She should hold off as long as she needs to before she does sit-down interviews. Their rules have been stacked for Donald Trump's favor for far too long, and she's not obligated to play that game. And until they decide they're going to treat this thing equally all the time, they're on the enemy's list.